The word evangelism excites some people and scares others. How do we understand evangelism today in light of our non-Christian neighbors who live right next door and who live lives of virtue? SMU professor Robert Hunt will be here with us to talk about just that and how we might think about it anew. Stay tuned for Good God. Welcome to Good God, conversations that matter about faith and public life. I'm your host, George Mason, and I'm delighted to welcome back to the program Robert Hunt. Robert, we're glad you're here.
Thank you.
Robert is the director of Global Theological Education at SMU, Perkins School of Theology, and also the director of the Center for Evangelism. Yes. And we're delighted to pick up a conversation that we started in our last time. Last time we talked, Robert, we were talking more specifically about the Methodist situation, the cultural assumptions that have gone into understanding Methodist as a global church, and the decisions that were made then that have actually fractured the church and challenged the notion of a united Methodist church over whether same-gender marriage could be blessed and whether gay clergy could be ordained and the like. But today I'd like us to talk a little more specifically about the work you do in evangelism, because it has a lot to do with this same question of culture.
Right.
So for many people who grew up in an evangelical Christian culture, evangelism has some connotations to it. I'll describe it this way. We have the full and complete truth in Jesus Christ, and it is our spiritual and moral responsibility to obey the Great Commission and take to every person, every ethnic group, every nation of the world this good news, to the end that they become followers of Jesus, they become Christians as well, regardless of their own faith tradition or the like, because ours is right and theirs is wrong. And therefore, when the world is fully Christianized or Jesus returns, whichever happens first, then we will have succeeded in our mission. That has created, for many people, lots of cognitive dissonance because of the way the world has come to our back door. It was easier to do or think that maybe when we sent you to Malaysia as a missionary, but maybe when a Malaysian neighbor moved in next door who is Muslim, we are a little less inclined. So what's happening in evangelism now that we're wrestling to rethink and try to get straight? What would you say?
Well, I think the first thing that's happening is that we're a lot of the false ideas followed by romantic ideas of the missionary era, let us say the 19th and early 20th century, or even the 20th century, we're realizing we're wrong, and that then troubles our underlying presuppositions. The first of those was simply that we have a natural virtue that comes to us as Christians that people in other cultures didn't possess because they lack our Christianity. It didn't take long for missionaries to realize that simply wasn't true, that there were virtuous people who were not Christians, that virtue and Christianity didn't go together. But something a little broader than that, lacking Christianity and the West, they're kind of barbarians, and then that slips too.
So we're going to bring Western civilization to them. It will be good for them, and they just don't know it yet. And that gets melded with the Christian faith to the point where then that breaks down, and the problems of Western civilization then become the problems for the church.
Well, exactly, and we could say that David Livingstone preached a famous sermon called Christianity, Commerce, and Civilization. I believe in 1860-something to the graduating class at Oxford, in which he said, these are the three things that we're going to bring to benighted Africa. Well, by the end of World War I, and certainly by the end of World War II, with the Holocaust, it was absolutely clear that speaking of the superiority of Western civilization was going to be nonsensical to anybody outside the West. Okay. Two vastly destructive wars simply didn't speak to some superiority of Western civilization or of Christian civilization.
Yes.
Okay. So this puts us in a mode of rethinking already, of partnership, of dialogue. And added to that, and specifically with regard to evangelism, is the idea that develops through the conversations of interfaith Christian groups, let's just say ecumenical Christian groups, who begin to recognize that we need to speak about God's mission in the world and that God is always in mission in the world, the so-called missio Dei.
Yes.
So that whatever we do in Christian mission and evangelism, we are going and finding where God has already been at work.
The church doesn't have a mission. God has a mission.
God has a mission.
And the church is simply catching up to God's mission.
That's right.
Yes.
And we do have our unique message.
Yes.
By the way, we have an absolutely unique message, and one that we are morally obliged to share
absolutely.
With everyone.
Yes.
But we no longer do it in a kind of a vacuum, an imagined spiritual vacuum where we bring something.
Yes.
God's there.
Yes.
So that's going to reform all of our ideas about evangelism.
This is my Father's world. The whole world is already God's.
That's right.
Right. God has already claimed the whole world.
Well, God is already working in the whole world.
Yes.
And by the way, we find this in an amazing place in Amos chapter 9 for people who are interested in the Bible.
Yes.
This is a section in Amos where, as usual, we have the sort of condemnations of the nations in chapter 8. Ending, of course, with the condemnation of Israel. It's a sort of, oh yeah, the nations are all really bad, and you are too.
Yes.
Always good.
We are too.
We are too.
Yes. Yes.
And then Amos attacks directly Israel's one claim to be unique. Well, God led us out of Egypt. And Amos says, and God led the Hittites out of Kir.
Wow.
And God led the Philistines.
Wow.
God has been active in every human history.
Yes.
There's no uniqueness.
I have to go back to read Amos. That's
I think it's worth reading.
Yes.
And then, of course, when we get into the New Testament, what we discover is phrases like Jesus meeting someone and saying, I have not found faith like this in Israel.
Yes.
Jesus meets people who are faithful who have never met Jesus.
Yes.
Okay. Now, when we keep that in mind, then that's going to change our outlook on evangelism. Because we're going to go into a situation asking not beginning with the idea that we have the truth and we must impart it. We begin with the idea that we are here to learn what God has done among you. We have something to say too, right? But this is dialogical now.
Yes.
This is dialogical. And when we can do that, I believe we can move away from the idea that the implicit idea that evangelism is getting people to join our team.
Yes.
And move to the idea that evangelism is opening the door for people to enter into a relationship with God through Christ.
Yes.
The form of that relationship, the affiliations that will form out of that relationship, are not something we can determine.
Okay.
We have something to offer, a community of faith.
Yes.
Okay.
A church.
A church. And that church should be open to everybody.
Right.
My experience is there are people who need it.
Yes.
Okay. But I'm not in a position to judge people who say, you know, I think what you are telling me about is a truth I already know about. I feel like a redeemed person.
Yes.
I feel like a person who lives in the ambit of God's love within my religious tradition and culture.
And this is problematic for the way we have taught evangelism.
Right.
Because much of our assumption is that the first thing we need to do is to explain to people how alienated from God they are to begin with.
Yeah.
To help them understand their sinfulness, and that sinfulness has created an ontological distance between themselves and God, we'll call it relational, that has eternal consequences to it. And so the first thing about the good news that we have to share is the bad news about who you are.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's a kind of oddness to that, I think, when you start to reflect about
Right.
how it would be that God is already at work in the world. Every human being is created in the image and
Right.
likeness of God, and God is at work everywhere. And yet, our first word has to be to reinforce the problem in order to then hold up the solution.
Right. Well, and I would say the problem in our terms.
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Right.
Sin as opposed to law.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
One of the interesting things about working in Asia is, I would say, and in Austria as well, the idea of feeling alienated from transcendent meaning,
Yes.
alienated from a sense of purpose in life. This sense of alienation is something that is a pretty universal characteristic. Okay, but the way in which it's framed in different cultures is different. And in some cultures, that framing may be so close to a Christian framing that our preaching of this sort of law and gospel makes perfect sense almost instantly.
Yes.
Okay. In other cultures, it will sound similar but actually be different.
Yes.
Right? And in other cultures, it will be completely different.
Right.
And one of the questions is, then we ask as an evangelist, as a practical matter, is, what does the redemption won in Jesus Christ mean for people whose understanding of alienation is different than ours? Does it mean they have to come and see things the way we see things about their alienation? Or is it possible that the redemption won in Jesus Christ is so universal that it actually addresses their sense of alienation where it is?
Yes.
Now,
So we have to actually understand their sense of alienation before we can actually hope to offer something.
exactly. We have
Yes.
to enter into a dialogue with them.
Yes.
And what's interesting when this happens is, of course, we may learn something about our own sense of alienation that we
right.
didn't know.
Right.
We may discover that there are depths to what God does for us in Jesus Christ that we haven't recognized earlier.
Yes.
Right.
Very good.
So that in the process of evangelism, we in some sense become evangelized.
Yes.
And
yes.
that critical dual process, I think, is the only thing that can give this integrity.
Yes.
And then also to recognize that the evangelist never evangelizes. The Spirit of Christ evangelizes.
Okay, good. Right.
Right?
Right.
The Spirit of Christ is going to move where it will and how it will and in what ways it will. And this gets us back to we don't form teams.
Yes. Right.
Right. It's too much of evangelism is based on church growth. Our
Yes.
United Methodist discussion has been fraught because both sides claim that either history's on their side or they have the more rapidly growing churches.
Yes.
Well, that proves nothing.
Yes. Right.
Okay. It's pretty useful to remember in the first couple of hundred years of Christianity that the surest sign that you had gotten it right was that you were dead.
That's right. We celebrate the
okay.
Christian martyrs.
We celebrate
that
the
era.
Christian martyrs.
Yes.
Look, by modern standards, the American Methodist mission to China, to Fuzhou, China,
Yes.
okay, if it had been in a contemporary American United Methodist setting, they would have pulled the plug before the first convert.
It's a bad business model.
No.
Yeah.
There were more missionaries that died in China
Yes.
than there were converts in the first 15 years.
There you go.
Okay?
Right.
Well, does that prove that they were wrong, that they weren't evangelical,
Right.
that they didn't have orthodox Christian beliefs?
Yes.
Of course not.
Right.
They were, by every modern standard, fundamentalists.
Yes. Right.
Right? We didn't have any progressives back then.
Right. Right.
So that kind of language proves nothing. Nor am I sure is there any human judgment that can be brought to bear on what constitutes success or failure.
Yes.
The only human judgment is the one that we bring to bear on ourselves, which is, have I been faithful?
Lovely. Yes.
Okay?
Lovely.
That's the only question we ask. Have I been faithful? If I have been faithful, God will take care of the rest. And this is what Paul brings up when he says, I watered, or I planted, Apollos watered. Somebody else could see the return.
Right. Right.
His
That doesn't
concern
make
is
me
to
a
be
failure.
faithful.
That's right. Exactly. Well, let's pick that up when we come back, because I want to talk a little more about the dialogical aspect of
Right.
this and your work in with the Parliament of Religions
Right.
and with the conversations with other faith traditions as well. And I think there's a lot to be learned about that. Let's take a break.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you for continuing to tune in to Good God. This program is available, as many of you already know, in various formats. You can take it as a podcast that is delivered to all the places you would go, whether Apple Podcasts or Google Play. And you can hear it weekly, and you can subscribe to it. A new episode drops every Thursday morning, and so we invite you to do that and subscribe. You can also find the video format in various places on the Facebook page, where we invite you to like Good God. You can also find it on YouTube and on Vocal Now, VOKALNOW.com, Vocal Now. So these are various places you can go. I'd also want to tell you that you can go to the website. That's www.goodgodproject.com. goodgodproject.com, and there you can find an archive of all of our previous episodes. If you like what you hear on any given week, you might actually like to have a transcript of the conversation. And if you go to the website, goodgodproject.com, you can find a transcript there also, where you can cut and paste and use what's been said in that conversation. So we'd invite you to find various ways to continue to tune in and to enjoy these conversations. One special thing I want to say is thank you to the friends of this program who have contributed financially to make it possible for us to do this without inviting you to have to give. We're grateful for the support of friends of this program, and I hope that you will be too. Please tell your friends about Good God and continue to tune in. Thanks for being part of it.
We're back with Robert Hunt. And Robert, we were talking about evangelism in a dialogical way.
Right.
That is to say, now we don't view that everyone outside of our faith tradition is simply a blank slate waiting for us to write the
Right.
good news upon them, but rather they are already subject to the work of God somehow in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that has taken a particular religious form, in fact.
Right.
Sometimes it's Muslim, and sometimes Buddhist, and sometimes
Right.
Jewish, and other kind of ways that are non-Christian. So you have been at work with the Parliament of World Religions on the one hand, lots of conversation among religious leaders from different faith traditions. Here in Dallas, you show up with Thanksgiving Square and the World Affairs Council and Faith Forward Dallas at Thanksgiving Square, where we have a real multi-faith environment.
Right.
How do you speak to your Christian tradition about what is to be valued in these conversations, and not simply say to them that we are, in a sense, forfeiting our evangelistic aim by entering into dialogue, as if entering into dialogue is an alternative to evangelism?
Right. Well, I think that's a good question. I'll go back to something I said earlier, which is we really have to recognize, and this is just logical, that what has been revealed to us in Jesus Christ is sufficient for our salvation and knowledge of God, but it is not complete.
Okay.
And it really cannot be complete if you think about it. We have a limited slice of history, and we have limited human brains.
And the risen Christ is still at work in the world, and God
Absolutely.
continues to reveal to us, even as Jesus said, I'm sending you the Spirit, more
Right.
things than you can bear today, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, the plenitude of this actually is written into Scripture.
Yes.
Jesus in John, but of course at the end of John, I suppose if we were to write everything that he has done, all the books in the world would not contain
That's
them.
right.
That clearly suggests that not only do we need big libraries, but we ought to read other books.
Aha.
Right? So I think that begins us as the dialogical process.
Yes.
We don't begin a dialogical process because we've somehow caved in on the truth we know in Jesus Christ.
Right.
We begin the dialogical process out of the absolute conviction that God still has things to teach us.
Good.
Okay? And that we still need to learn them.
Yes.
And so if we start the process that way, I think it begins to have some integrity, and our neighbors respect that. They respect that we know something true. We want to share that. That we also want to listen because we know they know something true as well.
Yes.
Now, the purposes of those dialogues are manifold. I still remain convinced that there is a strong place for a personal evangelistic dialogue. And I tell my students this. I'm not a universalist in the sense that I can just let go and say, well, God will take care of everything.
And all roads lead to God, regardless of what you believe. It doesn't make any difference, that sort of thing.
That to me is a nonsensical belief.
Yes. Okay.
Okay? God may draw everyone to God's self, as Christ does upon the cross, John, right?
Yes.
But we cannot assume that every human path leads to God.
Yes.
And that's just on the basis of our own personal human experience. We're pretty capable of running away from God.
Right.
And we shouldn't assume that if we're capable of it, others aren't as well. Okay. On the other hand, I can't really discern, right? So I would say in this sense, I'm agnostic toward whether someone has the possibility of reaching God on the road they're on.
Yes.
As we sit here, if someone is going down Mockingbird Lane in the westward direction and they stop and say, I'm on my way to Love Field, I would say, absolutely, keep going.
Right.
If it happens that they cross us on Abrams Road and say, am I on my way to Love Field, I could say, I doubt it, but if you took a right turn at the right place,
Yes.
you might.
Yes.
If they're going the other way, east on Mockingbird,
Yeah.
I'd have to say, I don't think you're going to get there, but the world is round.
Yeah.
It's
That's beautiful. That's good.
I can't say that I would advise you in this direction, but I can't tell you you'll never get there.
I see. Yes.
So there is a place for this individual conversation.
Yes.
In those individual conversations, I think there are some people who will say, I don't think I'm on the right road.
Yes.
For your talking and my talking, I think I see something that is attractive to me.
Yes.
That makes me want to be part of a community to explore that more. And I always think of the church as the evangelizing community. Come in and see if you want to join the road that we're on.
Yes.
Right? As opposed to just an individual making a decision. And I say this with some firmness because I don't want anyone to think that we can dismiss evangelism of this sort. Yes. Individuals need to make decisions. And I say this to my classes. They don't always like it. I have baptized Muslims who became Christian. Yes. I've baptized Buddhists that became Christian. I've baptized Hindus that became Christian. Most of my students for many years were converts to Christianity. I'm not going to dismiss their experience.
Right.
They did give up their families for this.
Yes.
That's critical to know.
Yes.
At the same time, I cannot, on the basis of their experience, generalize to every human being in the world and say, you need to follow that path. What I can say is, you have been redeemed by God in Jesus Christ, right? That's good news.
Yes.
That's good news. If you say to me, I already knew that. I knew it in a different way, I knew it in a different form, right? Or I believe that my religious tradition is leading me closer and closer to God, and therefore I want to stay within that discipline and that community, then all I can do is respect that.
Yes.
You have made that judgment. I just don't think that God has given me that window of knowledge.
But you've now talked about this in a way that I think is interesting. When we think about the classical three ideas of goodness, truth, and beauty.
Right.
What I heard you talking about a lot was language of drawing, being attracted to.
Right.
This has more of an aesthetic character to it.
Yes.
There is a sense of God calling people to a beautiful life, to an experience of that is more about wonder than a concession to an idea.
Yeah.
And so there is a lacking, I think, in the tradition of evangelism that I think a lot of people have known,
Right.
of acknowledgement of how God works through that sort of drawing into a beautiful experience of life, leading to a goodness as well, a kind of way of life that is good, in favor of instead always trying to prove propositionally that something
Right.
is true that you assent to.
Absolutely. The most dolorous effect of the Enlightenment was to separate truth from beauty.
Yes.
Okay? This would be unimaginable in Greek culture
Yes.
or the culture of Jesus' time.
Right.
Okay? Things that are true are beautiful. Things that are beautiful are almost always true.
Yeah, this is Keats' poetry, right?
Okay?
Yeah.
And we need to recognize that. So when we see a beautiful life,
Yes.
okay, then we're seeing there's something true there.
Yes.
And I think that liberates us some, because it means that, one, there's a whole new realm of evangelism,
Right.
which is the realm of putting, I would say, decisive and decision-forcing beauty in front of people.
Lovely.
I think this was the genius, actually, of the inklings of C.S. Lewis and Charles Williams
Right,
and
right.
J.R.R. Tolkien,
Yes.
is that they could create works that were beautiful, literary works, but would be thoroughly evangelistic,
Yes.
because they would draw someone into a world, and then they would lead a person in the classic way through an understanding of crisis and decision. Okay, and that idea in those literary forms, in poetry, in any kind of excellent art,
Yes.
right, is evangelistic. In a genuine sense, it's evangelistic. It's converting. And we need to therefore be much more attentive to this. It's quite possible that a Brandy Carlile song, like the Fool, I think, will play an evangelistic role.
Right.
Or I always think of a Mary Chapin Carpenter song, one line of which is, "I will serve the beauty but not the truth."
Wow.
Now, she's talking about lost love. Okay, so the truth is we're not together.
Yes.
The beauty is we were in love.
Wow.
So which of those is going to be the determinative factor?
Right.
You see?
Right.
So I think this aesthetic sensibility is absolutely on.
Yes.
The association of goodness with beauty and truth. If we can hold the three together,
Right.
then we're well on our way to having a useful dialogue. If we separate out truth into a set of propositions in a sort of enlightenment way and say, oh, I assent to these,
Yes.
and therefore I'm in,
Right.
or I fail to assent and therefore I'm out,
Right.
then I think we've hit a dead end, and we will inevitably decline and wither spiritually.
Well, I think this is where we have been recently in witnessing the capitulation of much of evangelical Christianity in America to the political culture of
Right.
of power, where the separation of believing the right things over here
Right.
gives you permission then to promote a way of life that is abhorrent to the gospel that you claim
Right.
to preach. And so that's where many people are falling out with the church today over that the cleft between this, on the one hand, claims of truth, and on the other hand, a kind of unattractive life, you might say.
Yeah. Well, it's an ugly life.
It is an ugly life. Yeah.
It's an ugly life.
Right.
And I think this is, people are repelled by the ugliness
Yes.
that they see.
Right.
And justifiably so. It's what's most unfortunate is when that ugliness finds its way into the church.
Yes.
And we have an ugly church. No one's going to come in. And we're unfortunately, all of us who are Protestants to some degree, some more than others, okay, are inheritors of an iconoclasticism that was a rebellion against Roman Catholicism.
Right.
That led to something sparse and spare. I'm not to say ugly, but sometimes the sparsity, the clean altar so there's no hint of idolatry, the lack of even a cross. You know, the old Vermont church that we used to go to with my uncle when we went on holiday where, oh my gosh.
Yes.
Well, that actually represented a certain aesthetic in its time, okay? But it eventually becomes a kind of a negative theology.
Right.
Where anything beautiful, ornate, florid is wrong.
Yes.
And then we're cut down to bare propositions.
Yes.
Right? Again, this equations are the truth. And I think that that is repellent to people. And we see some evidence that the so-called millennial generation is actually attracted to aesthetically pleasing worship.
Yes.
As opposed to sort of spare, bare bones.
Or performance worship.
Yeah.
You know, the spare bare bones on the one hand, or the great entertainment culture on the other, which they can get on their own. They don't need the church to do that for them.
Yeah, there's nothing when there's nothing distinctive.
That's right.
Right. When our praise music sounds like Celine Dion, Just Jesus.
Right.
Then then we have not actually adequately separated our aesthetic from a worldly aesthetic. And there's a difference.
There really is. Well, Robert, thank you for raising all of these ideas to us and challenging us to put them all together.
Sure.
We're grateful for your work and for you being here in Dallas, and thank you for being on Good God.
Happy to be here. Thank you very much.
Terrific. All right.